In a small, seemingly quiet town, two sisters Tiana and Tiara stood out not only for their striking resemblance as identical twins, but also for their determination and strength. The two black women had built careers in education, working with at-risk youth and challenging students to rise above their circumstances. Tiana, the older sister by only a few minutes, was particularly known for her no-nonsense approach as the vice principal of a local high school. Her role was specific and tough. She handled discipline and student behavior, making hard choices and enforcing rules for the sake of order. In her line of work, Tiana had made both allies and enemies, as often happens when one is tasked with keeping teenagers in line, especially in a community that faced economic hardship and social challenges. One of Tiana's recent cases involved a troubled young boy, James Briggs, the son of Officer Todd Briggs, a man with a long history on the force and a reputation that was both feared and respected. Known for his aggressive approach to policing and his barely hidden disdain for black people in particular, Briggs had spent years shaping his image as the town's hard-nosed enforcer. Many knew his unspoken rule: if you didn't fit into his version of respectable people, he would find a reason to make your life difficult. His son, James, had become a frequent face in Tiana's office due to various disciplinary issues, skipping classes, disrespecting teachers, and, increasingly, showing signs of violent behavior towards other students. Tiana had done her best to handle James with fairness, treating him as she would any other student, but there was no doubt that his father's shadow loomed large over him. Recently, after another serious incident involving James and another student, Tiana made the tough decision to put James on probation and recommend a behavioral evaluation. This decision had consequences, and she knew it. She had seen it in James's face when she explained the decision to him in her office, and she saw the same resentment mirrored in Officer Briggs's eyes when he came storming into the school the next day, demanding answers. Briggs's presence was forceful, intimidating even, but Tiana stood her ground, calmly explaining her rationale and refusing to retract her decision. She wasn't one to be intimidated, especially when it came to doing what she felt was right. Briggs left the school that day with a simmering anger, a hatred ignited not only by what he saw as a personal attack on his family, but also by the fact that it was a black woman who had dared to discipline his son. In his mind, she had overstepped her bounds. He felt humiliated that his son's reputation was now tarnished in the town and that a black woman had been the one to inflict that wound. This resentment festered within him, growing into a dark, twisted determination to get even. He began to see Tiana not just as an educator, but as someone who needed to be put back in her place. The tension between the two simmered under the surface for weeks. Briggs had no immediate opportunity to act, but his anger didn't fade, it only grew, fueled by a deep-seated resentment and the need to teach her a lesson. For him, this wasn't just about his son, it was about setting an example, reminding her that in this town he was the one with power. Briggs's twisted sense of justice made him believe he was simply restoring balance. He waited for the right moment, one that would allow him to strike without immediate consequences. That moment came one Saturday afternoon. It was a rare weekend when both Tiana and her sister Tiara had time off. The two decided to go out for lunch and catch up, visiting a small cafe on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place they enjoyed, unassuming and quiet, where they could talk without interruption. They laughed, reminiscing about their childhood and discussing plans for the future. Both were deeply committed to their community and shared dreams of opening an educational program for young girls of color, a safe space where they could find mentors and resources to help them succeed. As they enjoyed their meal, neither of them noticed the patrol car that slowed down as it passed the cafe's large windows. Officer Briggs, off-duty but always on the lookout for what he deemed troublemakers, had spotted the twins through the glass. Seeing Tiana in a relaxed, happy moment only intensified his anger. In his mind, she didn't deserve this, didn't deserve the respect she had in the community, didn't deserve a peaceful afternoon when she had dared to interfere in his life. With a sneer, Briggs pulled his car over and entered the cafe, intending to assert his authority. Tiana and Tiara looked up in surprise as he strode toward their table, his face hard and cold. The tone in his voice was sharp, hostile. Well, look who it is," he said, crossing his arms. "Taking a little break from ruining young lives, are we?" Tiana felt the familiar sense of tension rise within her, but she forced herself to stay calm, meeting his gaze evenly. "I don't know what you're talking about, Officer Briggs," she replied, her voice steady. "This is my personal time, and I'd appreciate it if you respected that." Briggs let out a bitter laugh, leaning closer to them. "Respect? That's rich, coming from you. Respect is something you earn. And from where I'm standing, you're far from earning it." Tyra felt her pulse quicken. She had heard about Briggs's reputation but had never been on the receiving end of his wrath. She placed a hand on her sister's arm, a silent signal to stay calm, but the look in Tiana's eyes was one of quiet defiance. She was tired of backing down from men like him, men who thought they could intimidate and belittle her just because of who she was. "Officer, if you have a problem with me, then address it through official channels," Tiana said firmly. "I'm not going to let you harass me in a public place." Briggs's face twisted with anger. He looked around, noticing a few patrons glancing their way, but he didn't care. In his mind, he was above reproach, and this was his town. His voice dropped to a menacing tone. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Thinking you can just mess with my family and walk away?" He turned his gaze to Tiara, who sat silently, sensing that things were about to get worse. "And you," he sneered, "don't think you're safe just because you're sitting here quietly. You're just as much a part of this as she is." Tiana felt a surge of protective anger rise within her. "Leave my sister out of this. She has nothing to do with any of it." Briggs ignored her, stepping even closer until he was looming over them. "No, I don't think I will. You both need to understand one thing: you don't run anything around here. You're nothing but a couple of girls playing dress-up in a world that doesn't want you." The tension in the room was palpable. The few other patrons, sensing the hostility, began to quietly leave, not wanting to get caught in the crossfire. Tiana knew they were alone now, facing an angry man who was abusing his authority to settle a personal score. But even as she felt fear creeping in, she refused to look away or show weakness. Briggs saw this as a challenge, a direct affront to his authority. His hand clenched, and he took another step forward, his face contorted with rage. "I think you need a reminder of where you stand, Ms. Vice Principal. I think both of you do." He let the threat hang in the air, savoring the fear he expected to see in their eyes. But instead of fear, he saw a mixture of anger and resolve. For Briggs, this was the final insult. Without thinking, he grabbed Tiana's arm, his grip bruising as he yanked her out of her chair, nearly pulling her off her feet. Tara gasped, reaching out instinctively to help her sister, but Briggs turned his fury on her as well. In his mind, this was justice, a way to remind them both who was in control. And as they struggled against his grasp, he felt a dark satisfaction settle in, knowing that no one would dare to question him. For Tiana and Tiara, however, this encounter was only the beginning. Officer Briggs's grip on Tiana's arm was brutal, his fingers digging into her skin with a force that sent a sharp pain radiating through her shoulder. Tiana, caught off guard, tried to pull away, but his hold was unrelenting. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and indignation. She could feel the eyes of her sister Tiara, watching in horror, and the quiet discomfort of the remaining few patrons who dared to glance in their direction. The air in the cafe was thick with tension, and every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. "Let go of me," Tiana demanded, her voice low but firm. She forced herself to look Briggs directly in the eyes, refusing to show him the satisfaction of her fear. But Briggs's face twisted into a smirk. He leaned in close, his voice a harsh whisper meant only for her and her sister to hear. "You think you can talk to me like that? You think I'm just going to sit back and let some person like you ruin my family?" The contempt in his tone was unmistakable, each word laced with the venom of his prejudice. Before Tiana could respond, Tiara stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "Officer, she hasn't done anything wrong. Neither of us have. You're crossing the line." Briggs's gaze shifted to Tiara, his smirk widening as he took in her fear. "Oh, crossing the line am I?" His hand, still gripping Tiana's arm, tightened further. "You don't get to tell me where the line is." He sneered at Tiara, relishing the intimidation in her eyes. "You both think you're so smart, don't you? I think you can just walk into my town, mess with my family, and act like you're untouchable. Not today." With a rough shove, Briggs forced Tiana back into her chair, her shoulder slamming against the hard wood with enough force to make her wince. Tiara instinctively reached out, her hands hovering protectively over her sister, as if to shield her from further harm. But her defiance only seemed to fuel Briggs's aggression. He leaned over the table, his large frame casting a shadow over the two sisters, his expression filled with a twisted satisfaction. "This town doesn't need people like you teaching our kids," Briggs sneered, his voice loud enough now that the remaining patrons began to shift uncomfortably, a few of them inching toward the door. "You think you're helping, but all you're doing is poisoning young minds, making them disrespect authority. And now you've gone after my son. Thought you could turn him against me." Tiana, struggling to keep her composure, met his gaze defiantly. "Your son needs discipline, Officer Briggs. He was disrupting other students and showing violent tendencies. It's my job to make sure he has the chance to change, to get on the right path. This isn't about you, it's about him." Briggs's face flushed red with fury. "Don't you dare talk to me about my son. I don't need some outsider lecturing me on parenting." He spat the word outsider as if it left a bitter taste in his mouth, emphasizing the difference he saw between himself and Tiana. To him, she was not only an outsider to his family, but an outsider to his very idea of what belonged in his town. Tiara, her voice trembling but resolute, spoke up again. "We're not outsiders. We work here. We're part of this community whether you like it or not." Her hand found Tiana's arm, squeezing it reassuringly as if to remind her that she wasn't alone. But the show of solidarity only deepened Briggs's resentment. He straightened up, his eyes narrowing as a cruel thought formed in his mind. "Fine," he said coldly, as if making a decision on the spot. "If you're part of this community, then you should understand that actions have consequences." Without warning, he pulled out his radio, speaking into it with a chilling calmness that belied the fury in his eyes. "This is Officer Briggs, requesting backup at the cafe on Main Street. I have 2 suspects here causing a disturbance." Tiana and Tiara exchanged a glance, the weight of his words sinking in. "Suspects?" Tiana managed to say, her voice a mix of disbelief and anger. "We're not causing any disturbance. You're the one harassing us." But Briggs ignored her, speaking into the radio with a steady, authoritative tone that left no room for interpretation. 2 black females mid-30s causing public disruption. Possible resistance. He shot them a cold smile, knowing exactly what he was doing and the implications of his words. By framing them as resistant suspects, He was ensuring that any responding officers would arrive expecting trouble. "Resistance? Are you out of your mind?" Tiara exclaimed, her voice rising with frustration and fear. "This is insane. We haven't done anything." Briggs turned to her, his smile thin and humorless. "You should have thought about that before you decided to bring your problems into my town. I don't care who you think you are or what kind of authority you think you have at that school. Out here, you answer to me." Within minutes, another patrol car pulled up outside the cafe, lights flashing. 2 additional officers entered, their faces set in grim expressions, clearly prepared for a confrontation. Briggs straightened up, his entire demeanor shifting to that of a calm, responsible officer dealing with troublemakers. He gestured to Tiana and Tiara, now visibly shaken, and spoke to the other officers in a voice that dripped with feigned professionalism. "These 2 ladies were causing a disturbance and refused to leave when asked," he said, his tone almost bored. "They got a little hostile, so I thought it'd be best to bring in some backup, just to make sure things stay under control." One of the officers, Officer Hale, looked between Briggs and the sisters, a flicker of doubt passing over his face. "A disturbance?" he asked, sounding unconvinced. "What kind of disturbance?" Briggs didn't miss a beat. "The kind where they don't know how to behave themselves in public. I had to ask them multiple times to calm down, but they got aggressive." He shot a look at Tiana and Tiara, daring them to protest. They could see the trap he was setting for them. Any sign of resistance, even a word spoken too forcefully, would give him the justification he needed to escalate things further. But Tiana, with a quiet, steely resolve, decided not to back down. "We weren't causing any trouble, officer," she said, addressing Hale directly, her voice calm but determined. "We were just sitting here, minding our own business. Officer Briggs approached us and started harassing us without any provocation." Briggs's expression hardened. "That's a lie," he said, his voice a low growl. "You were both being disruptive, and now you're lying to cover it up. Typical." Tiara, unable to contain her anger any longer, spoke up. "You're lying. You're twisting this around just because you have a personal vendetta against my sister." Briggs turned on her, his eyes gleaming with something close to triumph. "There it is. There's that attitude," he sneered. "This is exactly why people like you don't belong here." Officer Hale seemed to hesitate, but the second officer, clearly loyal to Briggs, nodded in agreement. "Maybe we should take them in, just to cool things down," he suggested, his tone casual, as if they were discussing a routine matter, rather than the unlawful detention of 2 innocent women. Before the sisters could react, Briggs seized Tiana's arm once more, pulling her roughly toward the door. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting an officer," he announced with grim satisfaction. Tiara tried to step between them, to shield her sister, but the second officer quickly moved to restrain her as well, ignoring her pleas. "Please, this isn't right," Tiara cried out, struggling against the officer's grip, but her words fell on deaf ears. In that moment, she understood the full weight of her helplessness. The power was entirely in their hands, and there was no one to stop them. As Briggs marched them outside, handcuffed and humiliated, Tiana felt a deep sense of despair settle over her. She had done everything by the book, had played by the rules her whole life, believing that her hard work and dedication would protect her. But none of that mattered now, not in the face of a man with the authority and intent to tear her down. The last thing Tiana saw as they were forced into the back of the patrol car was the smirk on Briggs's face. It was a look of pure, unbridled satisfaction, as if he had finally exacted the revenge he had been waiting for. The drive to the police station was tense and silent, broken only by the quiet hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio in the front of the car. Tiana and Tiara sat in the back seat, their wrists painfully restrained by handcuffs that bit into their skin with each jolt of the vehicle. Through the tinted glass divider, they could just barely see Officer Briggs in the driver's seat, his face set in an expression of cold satisfaction. Beside him sat Officer Hale, who had reluctantly gone along with the arrest, though he still seemed uneasy about the entire situation. Tiana could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes when he had glanced back at them, but he hadn't spoken up, and now it was too late. They were alone, trapped in the back of a police car, with no one to hear their side of the story. Tiara's breath was shallow, her face pale with a mix of fear and anger. She glanced over at Tiana, who, despite everything, sat with her back straight and her gaze unwavering, projecting a calm she didn't truly feel. Tiana was doing her best to remain composed, but the truth was she was terrified. Not for herself, but for her sister, who had only been there by coincidence and had been dragged into this nightmare simply because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Tiana," Tiara whispered, her voice trembling. "What's going to happen to us?" Tiana took a deep breath, steadying herself before she answered. "We're going to get through this, Tiara. Don't let him see that he's won. That's what he wants." Tiara bit her lip, nodding, but Tiana could see the fear in her eyes. She understood. She knew her sister was scared. How could she not be? They had been humiliated, handcuffed, and paraded out of a cafe like criminals, all because of a man who hated them for reasons beyond their control. A man who, despite the uniform he wore, was acting out of pure spite and hatred. And now, as they were driven toward the station, Tiana couldn't shake the growing realization that Briggs wouldn't stop here. This was only the beginning. As the police car pulled into the station parking lot, Tiana felt her pulse quicken. The station loomed ahead, an imposing, grey building that looked more like a fortress than a place of justice. Briggs parked the car, turned off the engine, and sat in silence for a moment, savouring the moment. Then, without a word, he stepped out and opened the back door on Tiara's side, grabbing her arm roughly and pulling her out of the car. "Move," he ordered, not giving her a chance to steady herself. Tiara stumbled, barely catching her balance as she was yanked out of the vehicle. Tiana followed, her eyes fixed on Briggs, her jaw clenched in defiance. She could feel the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior, but she forced herself to stay composed. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Briggs led them into the station, his grip like iron on Tiara's arm, guiding her toward the processing area. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh, unforgiving glow over the sterile hallways, and the echoes of their footsteps seemed to grow louder with each step. Officers at their desks glanced up as they passed, some with surprise, others with thinly veiled curiosity. Tiana noticed the way their eyes lingered on her and Tiara, two black women in handcuffs, escorted by one of their own. She could feel the unspoken judgments, the assumptions they were making without knowing the truth. Briggs led them to a small holding area, where he shoved them into a corner, forcing them to sit on a hard, cold bench. He removed their handcuffs, but the marks on their wrists remained, red and raw. Tiana rubbed her wrists, feeling the sting of the metal that had bound her, and glanced over at Tiara, who was breathing heavily, her face pale. "Stay here," Briggs ordered, his voice dripping with contempt. He looked at them with a sneer, as if they were nothing more than dirt under his shoe. "I'll be back to deal with you soon enough." With that, he turned and left, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the small room, leaving them in silence once more. Tiana took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Her mind was racing. searching for a way out of this, but every possibility felt like a dead end. They were trapped here, with no way to contact anyone, and no one who would believe them even if they could. They were alone, at the mercy of a man who seemed determined to make them suffer. Tyra's voice broke the silence, soft and trembling. "Tiana, I don't know if I can do this." Tiana reached over, taking her sister's hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "Listen to me, Tiara. We're going to get through this. He wants us to be afraid, to feel helpless. But we're stronger than that. We've faced worse, and we're still standing." Tiara nodded, though Tiana could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't blame her. This situation was beyond anything they had ever faced. But Tiana refused to give up. She wouldn't let Briggs win. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Briggs re-entered the room, accompanied by another officer, a burly man with a cold expression. Briggs's smirk had returned, and he looked down at them with a twisted sense of satisfaction. "All right," he said, crossing his arms. "Here's how this is going to work. You two are going to sit here quietly while we process your charges. Public disturbance, resisting arrest, maybe even assault on an officer, if I feel like it." Tiana's jaw clenched. "That's a lie, and you know it." Briggs's smirk widened. "Oh, I know exactly what it is. But it doesn't matter. You see, no one's going to take your word over mine. I'm the law here. You're just a couple of troublemakers who thought they could mouth off to a cop." The other officer chuckled, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Tiana felt a surge of anger, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew that reacting would only give them more ammunition to use against her. Briggs leaned in close, his voice a low, mocking whisper. "You think you're so tough, don't you? I think you can just walk around, looking down on people like me. But here's the thing, you're nothing. Out there you might have fooled a few people, but in here, you're just another criminal." Tiana met his gaze, refusing to back down. "This isn't over, Briggs. You can try to intimidate us all you want, but the truth will come out." Briggs laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "The truth? You think anyone cares about the truth? I could write up any report I want, and no one would question it. No one's going to come to save you, Tiana. You're in my world now." He straightened up, giving her a final, contemptuous look before turning to the other officer. "Let's get them into holding. I don't want to waste any more time on this." The officers led them down another hallway, through a maze of sterile white walls and fluorescent lights, to a small, grimy holding cell. The walls were bare, the air stale, and the cold metal bench in the corner offered no comfort. The cell door clanged shut behind them, the sound echoing through the narrow space like the final note of a cruel symphony. Tiana and Tiara sat side by side, their backs straight, their expressions set in grim determination. They could hear the muffled voices of the officers down the hall, the occasional burst of laughter, as if their suffering was nothing more than a joke to these men. It was infuriating, humiliating, but Tiana held on to her anger, letting it fuel her resolve. She wouldn't let them see her break. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Hours passed. The stark, fluorescent lights never dimmed, casting an unchanging, artificial glare over the cell. The sisters sat in silence, their exhaustion mixing with a stubborn resilience. Tiana's mind raced, trying to think of anyone who might realize they were missing, someone who could intervene. But her thoughts kept returning to one person, her husband, Alexi. Alexi would be looking for them. She knew that. And he wasn't the kind of man to sit idly by when something was wrong. He was ex-military, a man of principle and fierce loyalty, and he loved her more than anything in the world. If there was one person she could count on, it was him. As the hours dragged on, Tiana's hope clung to the idea of Alexi finding out, of him realizing something was wrong and taking action. She pictured him storming through the doors of the police station, demanding answers, refusing to leave until he saw her. It was a small comfort, but in that dark, claustrophobic cell, it was all she had. Just as she was beginning to lose track of time, the door at the end of the hall opened and Briggs reappeared. He looked smug, his eyes glinting with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd won. He stepped up to the cell, folding his arms as he looked down at them with a sneer. "Well, ladies," he drawled, his voice filled with false sweetness, "I hope you're enjoying your stay, because this is just the beginning." Tiana didn't respond, meeting his gaze with a silent defiance, but inside her heart was pounding. She knew that whatever he had planned, it was only going to get worse from here. But she held on to one thought, one shred of hope. Alexi was coming, and when he arrived, Briggs would finally see what true justice looked like. Hours dragged by in the dim, cramped holding cell, each moment intensifying the sense of isolation and helplessness that clung to Tiana and Tiara. The sisters exchanged occasional glances, but there were no words left to comfort each other. The reality of their situation had sunk in deeply. Officer Briggs had no intention of releasing them anytime soon, and the system, as he had made clear, was on his side. For Tiana, a spark of hope flickered only at the thought of her husband, Alexi. She knew he was not the type of man to let anything happen to her without a fight. Alexi was fiercely protective, and his past in the military had taught him the importance of loyalty and quick action. If he hadn't already realized something was wrong, he soon would. She clung to that thought, letting it bolster her spirits, though she was careful not to reveal her hope too visibly. Briggs would pounce on any sign of weakness or hope like a predator sensing prey. Meanwhile, back at their home, Alexi had indeed sensed that something was amiss. It had been hours since Tiana and Tiara had left for lunch, and they hadn't responded to any of his messages or calls. This was unusual for Tiana, who was always conscientious about keeping him updated, especially if plans changed. At first, Alexi had tried to brush it off as nothing. Perhaps they'd lost track of time or were busy in conversation. But the silence dragged on, and unease settled over him like a dark cloud. As he checked his phone for the 10th time, a call finally came through. It wasn't from Tiana, but from a mutual friend who had been at the cafe earlier. The friend's voice was hurried, almost panicked, as they relayed what they had seen. Alexi's heart pounded as he listened to the description of how Officer Briggs had stormed into the cafe, the confrontation, and how Tiana and Tiara had been taken away in handcuffs. The friend mentioned Briggs's name with a sense of dread, aware of the officer's notorious reputation in the town. Alexi didn't need to hear anything else. He thanked the friend quickly and hung up, his mind already racing with plans. He knew about Briggs's reputation, how he wielded his badge as a weapon, especially against black residents, and how his record was suspiciously clean despite numerous complaints. Briggs was protected by the system, but Alexi didn't care about that. Right now, his only concern was getting his wife and her sister out safely. Alexi grabbed his car keys and headed out, his jaw clenched and his gaze hard. As he drove toward the police station, his thoughts churned with anger and determination. This wasn't just about rescuing his wife, it was about standing up to a man who had abused his power for far too long. The memory of how Tiana had fought her entire life to be respected, to build her career and earn her place, filled him with an intense sense of purpose. He wasn't going to let Briggs strip her of her dignity. When he arrived at the station, Alexi parked his car and strode through the doors with a quiet intensity that caught the attention of the few officers at the front desk. His calm demeanor masked the storm brewing within him, but anyone who looked into his eyes could see the barely restrained fury. He approached the desk, his voice low and steady as he spoke to the officer on duty. My wife, Tiana Robinson, and her sister Tiara were brought in earlier today by Officer Briggs. I need to see them immediately." The officer looked up, surprised at the force in Alexi's tone, but he quickly masked it with a polite, albeit detached, professionalism. "I'm sorry, sir, but only family members who have been cleared through processing are allowed to visit detainees. Are you here as legal counsel?" "No," Alexi replied, his tone as hard as steel. "I'm here as her husband. Now, are you going to let me see my wife, or are you going to make me wait until I get a lawyer down here?" The officer hesitated, glancing toward the back of the station, where Briggs was likely lurking. "Sir, I can't make any exceptions. Officer Briggs specifically requested that no visitors be allowed until he finishes processing." Alexi's eyes narrowed. "And how long exactly does he plan to keep them in processing? Because as far as I'm concerned, this sounds more like a personal vendetta than any kind of legal procedure." The officer shifted uncomfortably under Alexi's piercing gaze, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Before he could respond, however, another figure emerged from the hallway, Briggs himself, his face twisted into a smirk as he approached. He was clearly relishing this moment, eager to assert his authority in front of Alexi. "Well, well, look who decided to pay us a visit," Briggs sneered, crossing his arms as he sized up Alexi. "I guess you got tired of waiting for your little missus." Alexi held Briggs's gaze, his expression unyielding. "I'm here for my wife and her sister. Release them." "Now." Briggs chuckled, shaking his head as if Alexi's words were nothing more than a child's tantrum. "Release them? You must be out of your mind. They were causing a disturbance, resisting arrest. They're lucky I'm not charging them with assault." "Assault?" Alexi's voice was icy, his fists clenching at his sides. "You mean to tell me that two unarmed women, who were minding their own business, posed such a threat to a grown man like you that you had to use force?" Briggs's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, stepping closer to Alexi. "You don't know what you're talking about. Those two were disrespectful, belligerent. I'm just doing my job." Alexi took a step forward, closing the distance between them until he was nearly nose to nose with Briggs. "Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass and intimidate people because of your personal grudges. We both know why you did this, Briggs. Don't pretend it's anything else." For a moment, a flash of uncertainty crossed Briggs's face, but his arrogance quickly resurfaced, and he leaned in, his voice low and venomous. "You think you can come in here and tell me how to do my job? I'd watch your mouth if I were you. You don't want to end up in a cell next to them." The threat hung in the air, but Alexi didn't flinch. He held Briggs's gaze with a calm intensity that bordered on deadly. He was past the point of fear. All that remained was the unshakable resolve to protect his family. "Is that supposed to scare me, Officer Briggs?" Alexi asked, his voice as steady as a rock. "Because all it does is show me exactly what kind of coward you are. You're afraid. Afraid of a strong black woman who stands up to you. Afraid of anyone who doesn't bow to your so-called authority. But let me tell you something, you've made a big mistake." Briggs's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Officer Hale, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, stepped forward, sensing that things were about to escalate beyond control. "Briggs," Hale said, his tone calm but firm, "maybe you should let Mr. Robinson see his wife. We don't need to make this any harder than it already is." Briggs shot Hale a withering glare, but Hale didn't back down. It was clear that he too was uncomfortable with the situation, and the presence of Alexi had only highlighted the ugliness of what was happening. Reluctantly, Briggs stepped back, muttering under his breath as he gestured toward the hallway. "Fine." 5 minutes, Briggs snarled, clearly displeased with the compromise. Alexi didn't wait for any further permission. He walked past Briggs, his shoulders squared, his expression determined. As he entered the holding area, he saw Tiana and Tiara sitting on a metal bench, their faces weary but resolute. The sight of them, handcuffed and treated like criminals, reignited the fire in his chest, but he kept his face calm for their sake. "Tiana," he said softly, his voice filled with a mix of relief and anger. "Are you okay?" Tiana looked up, her eyes brightening at the sight of him. She nodded, though her expression was strained. "I'm holding up," she replied, glancing at Tiara, who managed a small smile despite everything. Alexi sat down beside them, lowering his voice so that only they could hear. "This isn't over. I'm not leaving here without you both. Whatever it takes, I'll get you out of here." Tiana squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with gratitude. She knew Alexi's promise wasn't empty, he was a man of action, and she trusted him with her life. Before he could say more, the door opened and Briggs appeared, a scowl on his face. "Time's up," he said, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "Say your goodbyes. They'll be staying here for a while." Alexi rose slowly, turning to face Briggs, his expression unreadable. For a long, tense moment, the two men stared each other down, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. "Enjoy your power trip while it lasts, Briggs," Alexi said quietly, his voice filled with cold determination. "Because it's coming to an end." Briggs's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, dismissing Alexi with a wave of his hand. "Get out of here before I change my mind." Alexi cast one last glance at Tiana and Tiara, his gaze filled with silent promise, then turned and left the room. As he walked out of the station, his mind raced with plans. He knew he needed to act fast and decisively. This wasn't just about freeing his wife and her sister, it was about exposing Briggs for the corrupt bully he was, and he was willing to do whatever it took to see justice served. As Alexi exited the station, he felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders, but he welcomed it. He would face any challenge, tear down any wall, and confront any man who stood in his way to bring his family home. And in his gut, he knew Briggs had underestimated him. The reckoning was coming, and Briggs wouldn't see it until it was too late. After leaving the station, Alexi's mind was consumed with rage and determination. He knew Briggs would do everything in his power to keep Tiana and Tiara behind bars, hiding behind his badge and his connections. This wasn't just about getting his wife and sister-in-law released, it was about sending a message to men like Briggs, who thought they could abuse their authority without consequence. Alexi was no stranger to intimidation and conflict from his years in the military, and he knew how to handle men who used power as a weapon. But this time the stakes were personal, and that made all the difference. His first step was to gather as much evidence as he could to expose Briggs. He began by reaching out to the friend who had called him earlier, asking them to recount every detail they had witnessed at the cafe. Alexi recorded the conversation, creating a record of Briggs's aggressive behavior in public, the harassment, and the wrongful arrest. Next, he contacted a few other people in town who he knew had had run-ins with Briggs in the past. Their stories were disturbingly similar incidents of intimidation, excessive force, and threats of arrest if they stepped out of line. Alexi's blood boiled with every account, but he remained calm and methodical, noting every detail. He was building a case. As he moved through the town, Alexi picked up a few whispers here and there about Briggs's notorious reputation. It wasn't exactly news to anyone familiar with the officer, but people were hesitant to speak openly. Briggs had instilled a sense of fear in the community, and his influence ran deep. But Alexi was relentless, pressing people for information until he had enough to paint a damning picture. He gathered statements, recording his conversations, and keeping track of dates and incidents. He knew that, Alone, these stories might not be enough to bring Briggs down, but if he combined them with solid evidence of what Briggs had done to Tiana and Tiara, he could force the department and the town to take notice. With his groundwork laid, Alexi returned to the station early the next morning. The cold, steely resolve in his eyes had only sharpened overnight. This time, he wasn't coming as a concerned husband, but as a man ready to confront corruption head-on. He walked up to the front desk, his jaw set, and demanded to speak to the station chief. The officer at the desk, taken aback by his intensity, quickly relayed the message. After a tense few minutes, a tall, weary-looking man with greying hair emerged from the back office. Chief Randall was known for his calm demeanor, but as he looked at Alexi, he saw a fury that wouldn't be easily appeased. "Mr. Robinson, I understand you have concerns regarding the arrest of your wife and her sister," Chief Randall said, his voice carefully neutral. "Concerns?" Alexi replied, his voice low and dangerous. "Chief, your officer, Briggs, harassed, humiliated, and unlawfully detained my wife and her sister. This goes beyond concerns." Randall sighed, glancing toward the door as if ensuring they were alone. "Look, I know Briggs can be a bit forceful at times, but he's been with us for a long time. He knows the community, and we trust his judgment." His judgment? Alexi took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Chief, I have witnessed statements that detail how Briggs has harassed my wife, how he used force without any provocation. And that's not all. I've spoken to others in town who have been victims of his so-called judgment. This man is a liability, and if you don't act, you're complicit in his actions." Randall hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. He shifted, rubbing the back of his neck as he considered his words. "Mr. Robinson, this isn't a simple matter. Officer Briggs has connections in this town. His record may have a few complaints, but he's always managed to resolve them. Our department is under-resourced as it is. We can't afford to lose officers." Alexi's eyes narrowed. "So you're willing to protect a man who abuses his power just because it's convenient? What about the people he's supposed to protect? What about my wife?" Randall opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, a familiar, unwelcome voice cut through the room. Well, if it isn't Mr. Robinson, back for another visit." Briggs sauntered into the lobby, his smirk firmly in place, clearly relishing the sight of Alexi in a losing battle. "Didn't get enough last night, huh?" Alexi turned to face him, his fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the rage boiling within him, barely held in check. He wanted nothing more than to knock the smug expression off Briggs's face, but he knew that would only play into the officer's hands. "You think you can get away with this, Briggs?" Alexi said, his voice cold and even. "You think you can intimidate my family, abuse your power, and walk away without consequences?" Briggs laughed, crossing his arms as he leaned against the wall. "What consequences? I'm doing my job, Robinson. Your wife and her sister were causing a disturbance, and I handled it. Simple as that." Alexi stepped forward, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "This isn't over. I'm not going to let you destroy my family's life because of some sick vendetta you're holding on to." Briggs's smirk widened. "You're welcome to try, but let me give you a little advice, Robinson. You're in my world now. And in my world, I'm the one with the power. So unless you want to end up in a cell next to them, I suggest you walk away." Before Alexi could respond, Chief Randall intervened, stepping between them. "Enough, both of you," he said, his voice firm. "Briggs, you've made your point, Mr. Robinson. I understand your frustration, but this is not the way to handle it." Alexi glared at Briggs one last time before turning to Randall. "I'm going to get my wife out of here, Chief, whether you help me or not." and if I have to bring this entire station down to do it, so be it." With that, Alexi turned and left the station, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't rely on the system to hold Briggs accountable, but he wasn't out of options yet. As he walked to his car, a plan began to form in his mind, a way to expose Briggs publicly in a way that couldn't be ignored or brushed aside. First, Alexi made a call to a journalist he knew from his time in the military. The reporter, James Carlisle, had a reputation for exposing corruption and wasn't afraid to take on controversial cases. Alexi briefed him on the situation, providing all the details he had gathered about Briggs and his history of abuse. James agreed to help, promising to look into the allegations and start gathering more testimonies from others in the community. It was risky, but Alexi knew that once the story went public, Briggs's actions would be scrutinized in a way the police department couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, James worked tirelessly, interviewing witnesses, compiling evidence, and documenting the stories of those who had suffered under Briggs's rule. Each testimony painted a clearer picture of a man who had long ago abandoned his duty to serve and protect, replacing it with a personal vendetta and a penchant for brutality. But Alexi wasn't done. He had one final move to make, one that would hit Briggs where it hurt the most. Late one night, Alexi returned to the police station, waiting in the shadows until he saw Briggs leave. Following him from a distance, Alexi tailed the officer to a local bar, a place Briggs often frequented, where he felt comfortable and safe. Alexi knew it was dangerous, but he had reached his breaking point. This confrontation was inevitable. Inside the dimly lit bar, Briggs sat alone, nursing a drink with a smug expression on his face. He didn't notice Alexi until he was right beside him, his presence impossible to ignore. "Enjoying yourself, Briggs?" Alexi said, his voice calm but filled with an edge of menace. Briggs looked up, startled, before his face twisted into a scowl. "What the hell are you doing here?" Alexi sat down across from him, his gaze unflinching. "I came to give you one last chance, Briggs. Release my wife and her sister, drop the charges, and walk away. Otherwise, I'll make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of man you are." Briggs laughed, shaking his head. "You really think you scare me, Robinson? You're nothing. You think a few sob stories from people who can't follow the law are going to bring me down?" Alexi leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "It's not just their stories. I've got witnesses, a journalist, and a community that's tired of your bullying. Once this hits the news, you won't have a badge to hide behind." Briggs's face darkened, his bravado slipping as the weight of Alexi's words sank in. For the first time, he looked genuinely unsettled, the smug confidence giving way to a flicker of fear. "You don't know who you're messing with," Briggs said, his voice wavering slightly. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Alexi replied, standing up and towering over Briggs. "You're a coward hiding behind a badge. And your time is up." With that, Alexi turned and walked away, leaving Briggs alone with his drink, his mind racing with the realization that he might not be as untouchable as he thought. The next morning, the story hit the local news, sparking outrage throughout the community. The evidence James had compiled was damning, and as people read about the extent of Briggs's abuses, the pressure mounted on the police department to take action. By the end of the day, Briggs was suspended pending an investigation, his career hanging by a thread. The charges against Tiana and Tiara were quietly dropped, and they were finally released, free at last but shaken by the ordeal. As Tiana embraced Alexi, her gratitude was mixed with relief and pride. They had won, but at a cost, an indelible reminder of the fight they would always face. But they knew one thing for sure: together, they were unstoppable. And men like Briggs would never silence them again. The suspension of Officer Briggs sent shockwaves through the town. The community was divided. Some were outraged, finally feeling vindicated after years of mistreatment, while others, loyal to Briggs and distrustful of change, grumbled about outsiders stirring up trouble. The story about Briggs's abuse of power continued to gain traction, with testimonies from past victims pouring in. Every new account painted a picture of a man who had consistently abused his position, leaving a trail of intimidation, fear, and broken lives. For Briggs, the suspension was a crushing blow, but he wasn't done fighting. In his mind, he was the victim targeted and betrayed, not only by Alexi and Tiana, but by a town he had supposedly protected for years. Seething with resentment and desperate to salvage what remained of his career, he began working behind the scenes, contacting old friends on the force, looking for support, and trying to discredit Alexi and his family. Briggs knew that if he could undermine them, he could turn the tide in his favor. Meanwhile, Alexi was painfully aware that his fight with Briggs wasn't over. Though Tiana and Tiara were now free, Briggs's allies in the department were still holding out hope that he'd be reinstated. Alexi had accomplished a lot by exposing Briggs, but there was still work to be done. This was more than a personal vendetta. Now it was a fight for justice in a system that had allowed Briggs to thrive for far too long. A week after the suspension, Alexi received an anonymous tip. Briggs was planning something. The message was brief and cryptic, hinting that Briggs had been seen meeting with a few officers who were known to share his views. Though Alexi had no proof of a concrete plan, he sensed that Briggs wasn't going down quietly. The officer was cornered, humiliated, and ready to lash out, and Alexi was determined to be ready for whatever Briggs might attempt. Sure enough, that night, Briggs showed up unannounced at Alexi and Tiana's home. He wasn't in uniform, but his stance was unmistakably aggressive, his eyes wild with anger and desperation. Alexi, sensing trouble, met him at the door, his body blocking the entrance protectively. Tiana stood behind Alexi, her gaze steady but filled with fear and defiance. "Come to gloat, Briggs." Alexi's voice was low, filled with a dangerous calm that belied the tension in the air. Briggs sneered, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You think you've won, don't you?" He spat, his voice laced with venom. "You think you've destroyed me, but I'm still here. I'll always be here, and I'm not finished with you." Alexi took a step forward, his eyes locked onto Briggs with a steely intensity. "You've lost, Briggs. The community knows what you are. The department is finally seeing it too. It's over." But Briggs laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a chill through the room. "Over? You don't understand, Robinson. People like you think you can come into my town, destroy my life, and just walk away." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I'm going to make sure that you and your precious family regret this. I'll make your lives hell." Alexi's expression remained calm, but Tiana could see the controlled fury in his eyes. He'd had enough. Stepping forward, he positioned himself directly in front of Briggs, leaving no room for threats or intimidation. "You're trespassing, Briggs," Alexi said coldly. "Leave now or you'll regret it." Briggs laughed again, his face twisting with contempt. "Or what? You think you can just—" Before Briggs could finish, Alexi's patience snapped. With a swift, controlled movement, he pushed Briggs back, sending him stumbling off the porch and onto the lawn. Briggs struggled to regain his balance, his face flushing with rage and humiliation. For a moment he seemed ready to launch himself at Alexi, but then he caught sight of neighbors watching from their windows, curious about the commotion. Realizing he was losing control of the situation, Briggs snarled, glaring at Alexi and Tiana with a mixture of hatred and frustration. "This isn't over, Robinson. I'll be back." Alexi watched as Briggs stalked off into the night, his threat hanging heavy in the air. Tiana reached out, taking Alexi's hand, her grip tight and trembling. She knew that Briggs was dangerous, especially now that he had nothing left to lose. But as she looked into Alexi's eyes, she saw an unshakable resolve. He wouldn't let Briggs tear their lives apart. He would do whatever it took to protect her. The next day, Alexi took his final step in dismantling Briggs's power. He reached out to local advocacy groups, sharing his story and the testimonies he'd gathered about Briggs. Soon, there was a rally organized in front of the police station, demanding accountability and an overhaul of the department's internal policies. People from all over town, including those who had once feared Briggs, gathered to show their support. They held signs, chanted for justice, and shared their own stories of mistreatment at Briggs's hands. The media picked up the story, and the pressure on the police department grew. Chief Randall, who had previously hesitated to take action against Briggs, finally had no choice. Faced with overwhelming evidence and a community demanding justice, he officially terminated Briggs from the force. Briggs's allies within the department were warned that any attempts to retaliate against the Robinsons or anyone else involved would lead to immediate disciplinary action. For Briggs, it was the final blow. He had lost everything: his badge, his reputation, and his control over the people he had once dominated. As he watched the news coverage of the rally and saw the faces of those he had terrorized now standing united, he felt a crushing sense of defeat. In his mind, Alexi and Tiana had destroyed his life, and he had nothing left. That night, as the town began to settle down and the rally dispersed, Alexi and Tiana sat together in their living room, exhausted but relieved. They knew that this battle had changed them, but they also knew they had made a difference. Their fight had exposed the corruption that had gone unchecked for too long, and their courage had inspired others to speak out. Tiana leaned her head on Alexi's shoulder, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Alexi. I don't know what I would have done without you." Alexi wrapped his arm around her, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "We did this together, Tiana, and we did it for everyone who's ever been afraid to stand up." They sat in silence, comforted by each other's presence, knowing that although the battle had been hard, they had come out stronger on the other side. And as they held each other close, they felt a renewed sense of purpose, a promise to continue fighting for justice, for themselves, and for everyone who deserved to be seen, heard, and protected. In the weeks following Briggs's termination, the town slowly began to adjust to the absence of a man who had once held so much unchecked power. The community felt lighter, and people who had lived under the shadow of Briggs's intimidation started to come forward, sharing their own stories of his abuse. The outpouring of voices only solidified the impact of Alexi and Tiana's fight, bringing long overdue change to the police department. As a result of the public attention, the police chief initiated mandatory sensitivity training for all officers, focusing on community engagement and anti-bias practices. An independent review board was established to handle complaints against officers, ensuring that cases like Briggs's wouldn't be buried or ignored. It was a small but crucial victory, a step toward restoring trust in a system that had once turned a blind eye to injustice. Tiana returned to her work at the high school, greeted with a newfound respect from her colleagues and students. Her experience had changed her, deepening her resolve to make a difference in the lives of her students. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, knowing that she had faced the worst and emerged stronger. Her story, now well known, became a source of inspiration for her students, especially those who felt marginalized. They saw in her someone who wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right, no matter the personal cost. One afternoon, As Tiana walked through the school halls, a student approached her. It was James Briggs, the boy whose behavior had initially triggered the confrontation with his father. He looked uncertain, shifting his weight as he finally gathered the courage to speak. "It's Robinson," he said quietly, his voice tinged with shame. "I'm sorry. For everything." Tiana looked at him, seeing not the son of her former adversary but a young man trying to find his way. She smiled gently and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, James. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do to move forward." James nodded, visibly relieved, and Tiana felt a warmth spread through her. She had broken the cycle of animosity, choosing compassion over bitterness. It was a reminder of why she had chosen this path in the first place, to guide and uplift, even in the face of adversity. Meanwhile, Alexi's efforts didn't go unrecognized. The town council awarded him with a Community Leadership Award, recognizing his courage and resilience in the face of corruption. The ceremony was held in the town square, attended by friends, family, and neighbors who had witnessed his and Tiana's journey. Alexi accepted the award with humility, delivering a brief but powerful speech that resonated deeply with everyone present. "Our fight wasn't just about one man or one injustice," he said, his voice steady and clear. "It was about standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. I hope our story inspires others to do the same, to believe that change is possible when we come together." As he spoke, he caught Tiana's eye in the crowd. She smiled at him, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. They had faced a dark chapter together, and now they stood on the other side, stronger and more united than ever. In the days that followed, life began to settle back into a comforting rhythm. Tiana and Tiara, once strength found strength in the community that had rallied around them. Their story had become more than just a fight for justice. It had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged. One evening, as Tiana and Alexi sat together on their porch, watching the sunset, Tiana turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think it's over, Alexi?" she asked, her voice soft. "Do you think men like Briggs will finally understand that they can't treat people like this anymore?" Alexi took her hand, his fingers warm and steady around hers. "I think we showed them that there are consequences. And I think we showed this town what it means to fight for each other." He paused, glancing out at the quiet street. "But there will always be people like Briggs. The difference is, now people know they don't have to be afraid." Tiana nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace. They had done more than seek justice. They had helped reshape the fabric of their community, inspiring others to stand up for themselves and for each other. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm gold glow over their home, Tiana knew that they had left a lasting legacy. In the end, their journey was a testament to the power of resilience and unity. Together, they had faced down a force of hatred and corruption, and together, they had emerged victorious, not only for themselves but for everyone who believed in a world where justice and compassion would always triumph over fear.